Okay. Nitaniku Enkki. Hello. My name is Grant Manyheads, and I'm one of the interpreters here at Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. And today we're going to talk about the Blackfoot Tipi. But before we get into the Blackfoot Tipi, first, the Blackfoot peoples and our sacred relationship we have with the buffalo and our land, which we considered sacred. So the buffalo, in our Blackfoot language, we call the buffalo, or the American bison, Ini. If you call a herd of buffalo, we'd say Iniksi. But Ini was our staff of life. So basically that meant that it provided our food, our clothing, and our shelter, and hundreds of other uses that the Blackfoot people used from this animal. So to the Blackfoot, this animal was considered sacred. It was a sacred animal. So wherever Ini roamed on the northern plains, the Blackfoot followed. So basically the buffalo defined our territory. If you look at this next image, well, for thousands of years, the Siksikaitsitapi, are the Blackfoot speaking peoples, we were nomadic pedestrians, which basically means we were on foot and we traveled distances on foot, and basically we also hunted Ini on foot. So pedestrian is a word meaning people who are walking over their land. And nomadic means you sort of wander or roam. So wherever the buffalo roamed, we followed. We hunted Ini with weapons of our own manufacture. So we made our own weapons and we used these to hunt, but we also used them to protect our lands from enemy tribes. So we traveled overland on foot, following the herds, as I mentioned, wherever they roamed. So let's move on to the next image. Now you can see the dogs beside the guy, and these are travois. These dogs are actually carrying people's goods. Well, from time immemorial, basically meaning back into the distant past, could have been thousands of years, because we walked all over the land, we knew every detail of this land that we considered our sacred or our traditional territory. And we knew these lands really well because our people, such as you see in the picture, traveled over the lands constantly on foot. So we got to know our lands very, very well. And our trails were well marked across all of the grasslands. If we move to the next image, we could see here the dog being used again for that purpose of moving things. But throughout most of the year, hunting bands is what we broke up into, moved from one temporary encampment to another. So from one place to the other, and in those days they didn't travel very far, maybe 3 to 5 miles. But they would follow the buffalo over the open grasslands, and each family was responsible for the movement of its own luggage, or baggage. Now if we move to the next image, what we see here is a dog pulling a travois. Now the family's largest and heaviest possession was a tipi, which was a conical structure. It was a lodge with a foundation of poles, and the Blackfoot used 4 poles, over which was stretched a cover of buffalo hides. Now the size of the tipi was limited by the weight the dog could carry. And these are more like wolf-like dogs, the dogs that the Blackfoot used, as opposed to some of the domestic dogs that you see today. And some of these animals were able to carry or pull up to 80 pounds across the prairies. So that was a pretty good haul for a dog, 80 pounds. Some of them would be lighter, but we couldn't carry that many possessions in those days because we were limited by the animal, by the dog, as to how much it could actually carry. Now if we go to the next image, this is a tipi that would have been roughly the size our people would have been living in during the dog days. Now in those days, it could have been anywhere from 10 to 12 feet. And the poles that you would use were basically the same poles you would use for your tipi. So in the dog days, our teepees were much smaller compared to today. And the teepees were 10 or 12 foot high with a base of 10 or 12 feet. And stones, rather than pegs, were used to keep the teepee hide grounded. The poles used to put up the teepee frame were also used to transport the teepee in the wooden sled that we called a travois. So in the dog days, things were a little bit smaller, and maybe 5 to 6 people could sleep comfortably inside of this teepee. And in the winter, there would be a fire in it, so you'd be pretty warm. But the teepees were a lot smaller in the dog days than they were after the horse came. So we mentioned the travois. Well, to keep pace with the buffalo herds, we use imidakes, or imida, dogs, to pull these wooden sleds called travois. And so on these sleds were everything we needed. Our teepees to live in, meat, and pemmican stored in parfleche bags, and other camp utensils. And as I mentioned, the poles used to make the travois also were used for the frame of the teepee. So you can see the two different types of travois they have here. The one on top with it was a basket made out of willow. Well, these were pulled by dogs. The thicker part of the branches were up top, not near his neck, and the skinny part of the branch was down on the ground. Well, it was reversed for the horse, because if you look at the bottom one, that's a horse travois. And the thin parts are tied up near the horse's neck, and the thick parts are on the ground, because they can carry that much more. So these were the wooden sleds that they called travois, that Blackfoot would use to pull their camp, basically. Now this next image is of teepee rings. Well, the circles of stones were normally used to hold down the edges of the lodges, as we mentioned in the dog days. So the old teepees were made of buffalo skins, and they're much heavier than the canvas ones that we have today. They could not be blown away as easily. So stones were able to hold them in place. But when we started to use canvas, we had to use pegs, or our teepees would blow over. Stones were also used between the pegs. So we know this because if you go over the prairies today in southern Alberta or in Saskatchewan or even in Montana, you'll find these teepee rings, and there's hundreds, if not thousands of them, that are still in the prairies, and you could see them, that the stones on the outside were used to hold down the hide. And in some of them, especially winter camps, you would see stones on the inside which were actually the hearth, or where the fire would have gone. So these are evidence of how our people used to live thousands of years ago. So if we move to the next image, excuse me a moment here. Now this image here is another picture of the travois. So you can see how much longer the poles were for the horse as compared to the dog. And since we were using these poles to put up the frames of our teepees, you could see how much bigger the teepees would have been once we got the horse compared to the dog days. Now we'll talk, this is a Blackfoot camp. You notice it's in this picture here, it's the women. The men are there, of course, and they're helping, but it was the women who put up our teepees. Our mothers and grandmothers, our Blackfoot people believed, put up these structures. And the Blackfoot people were unique in the way that we put up our structures, but we'll get into that in a little bit here. So let's go on to the next image. This is Nitawasi, or basically our name for our land. Now, I'm not too sure if I'm saying this right, and if there's people out there who wish to correct me at some later point, they can do so. But I believe you'd say Nitawasinani, basically meaning we are the people of the land of the buffalo. So that's what the Siksika are. Wherever the buffalo went, as I mentioned, we followed. So the buffalo basically defined their territory. So if you look at just the map, wherever the great northern herds roamed, our people followed them. So our territory, as I mentioned, was defined by the buffalo. So ancient stories, our ancient stories, tell us that we were given this territory by Siksikaitsitapi, or the creator, or the essence of life. Apistatoki means creator. Well, the same stories tell us that Ini, or the buffalo, was created as a gift for our people. Our stories reflect many of these sacred sites throughout our vast territory. As you can see from that map, it is pretty big area. The Blackfoot people were on the northern plains, and if you look at the top part of the map there, you can see Edmonton and Prince Albert. Well, that would have been like our farthest as far as the Buffalo Range goes, and then all the way down to the Yellowstone River in present-day Montana, USA. That's how far south our sacred territory was. And there's a lot of places within this area that are sacred to us, as I mentioned. A lot of stories. They have the Crow's Nest, you have what they call Chief Mountain and Cypress Hills, and so many other places. Well, we lived by hunting the four-footed game and collecting plants. So our people knew the places where the certain plants grew and where game was plentiful. So by moving camp frequently, we never depleted the resources in one particular area. So when we came back the next year, there'd always be that resource still there. So our people, we did a lot of land management within our own territory as well, making sure that the plants, the berries, or whatever's that we're looking for is still there from year to year. So we can go to the next image. We moved from one place. When we moved with purpose. It wasn't just to find another river to camp on. Usually we knew all the places where we could go to find Saskatoons, or to find berries, or to find healing roots, to find lodgepole pine in the mountains or in the Cypress Hills. So our people, when we needed different things, we went to certain places for a reason. But while we were traveling, we were always following the buffalo, because that was our mainstay. That was basically what we survived on. Now, our traditional territory extended from the North Saskatchewan River, as I mentioned. That's up there by Prince Albert and Edmonton on the map, and all the way south down to the Yellowstone River. Now, this Yellowstone River emptied into the Missouri, and as far as the Qu'Appelle Valley are the Touchwood Hills, which are in present-day eastern Saskatchewan. Our people have stories of living in these areas. So we know that this was part of our traditional territory at one time. And from, of course, the western boundary would have been the Rocky Mountains. And the Blackfoot called that the backbone of the world. So from the backbone out, north, south, this is what we considered our traditional territory. So we can move on to the next image. So our people believe that this territory and all the resources in it had been given as a gift to us by the Creator for our specific use. So other tribes were welcome to come and visit and trade, but not to take our game and resources. So over the centuries, the different bands of Blackfoot, the different bands among our people developed the habit of living in different parts of our territory. But just as a point, our people, whether you were Piikani or if you were Blackfoot, Siksika or Gaina, we traveled freely throughout our country. There wasn't one particular place that you lived, but as I mentioned, when you were moving camp, they went to different places for different reasons to collect either plants or lodgepole pine or anything like that. But they moved freely throughout our territory. And even our allies, the Grovin and the Tsuut'ina people, they were actually allowed to freely move throughout our territory too, because we were allies and we basically were friends. But other tribes had to ask permission. And this is when we usually had a treaty or a peace treaty or a parley, a sit down of some sort to make an agreement, negotiate, to avoid bloodshed and war. But those things happened and they didn't happen. But let's move on to the next slide. Now, as you can see from the slide there, the Siksika were usually found along the northern and eastern part of our territory, which would have kind of extended all the way to present-day kind of Prince Albert. That would have been Grovin, but it was still considered part of our traditional territory. So the Siksika, as I mentioned, were usually found along the northern and eastern part of our territory, and the Gaina lived in the central part. And the Piikani camped in the mountains and along the foothills to the west. And there was a band called the Inuksiks, and I guess it translates to small robes. But this was a pretty big band, and they were kind of listed in the trade records as a separate group. But they lived in the mountains and on the western slope, kind of where the Bitterroot Valley is in present-day Missoula, the Flathead area, Flathead Lake, that whole area there. That this was where the Blackfoot actually camped as well. This was one of our homes. So the Blackfoot territory extended over a huge, huge territory. Well, we mentioned that old tribe there. If we look at this next image, you see the Siksikaitsitapi that exist today that make up the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. And we can see there the Siksika and the Gaina, but also you see the Piikani and the Amskapi Piikani. So these four tribes today make up the Blackfoot confederacy, for lack of better words, but in our language we would say the Siksikaitsitapi. So that's a little bit about our Blackfoot history. Let's move on to the Tipi. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our teepees were unique. The Blackfoot were unique in their types of teepees because we used 4 poles as opposed to 3. Now, from what I understand, and if there's other people who want to correct me or add on to what I'm saying, but the Blackfoot were the only tribe other than the Crow and other than the Tsuut'ina who learned it from us, and the Kiowa, I believe. These were the only tribes that used 4 poles to put up their teepee frame. Every other tribe in North America that has a buffalo skin teepee all used 3 poles. And a lot of these tribes originally were from the east and didn't live in these types of dwellings. So it's a Blackfoot belief that we invented this particular type of dwelling, and that it was our mothers and grandmothers who fixed it up over the years to make it what it is today. So you see the different ties there at the top of the picture. The Blackfoot had a specific way of tying their poles and putting up their teepees. And as you see in the other one, they had 3 poles and they had a different way altogether compared to the Blackfoot. Now, if you look at the teepee covers, of course, were made of buffalo hide. So it was pieces of buffalo hide sewn together that made that teepee. And depending on how many buffalo hides you had on it or how much you could carry, would depend on the size of your teepee. As we mentioned in the dog days, our teepees would have been much smaller, so you wouldn't have the need of that many buffalo to make your teepee. But as the teepees got bigger, well, then you'd require more buffalo. Sort of like having 8 hides or 10 hides to make a dog days teepee, to needing 15 to 18 to make a 30-foot teepee or so. So if we look at the next image, you can see some other pictures here, images of the teepee itself, how it was set up, how the 4 poles would have been kind of positioned. And then you could see the setup that the 4 poles kind of make a square in the middle of the teepee, and that on one side is the door facing east. So the Blackfoot used 4 base poles for their teepee. And as I mentioned, it was buffalo skins that made our teepee covers. So the size of the teepee would depend on how many buffalo we'd use. In the later days of the buffalo, when there was teepees that were like 30 feet high, 30-foot base, they were huge, and they would have required well, actually double the size of buffalo hides to make it, but they would make it in 2 pieces, and it would have to be moved in 2 separate travois, and when they get there, they would put together the whole teepee. So some teepees were huge, but this is a pattern of a skin teepee cover as to how it basically would have been stitched together. And you see in this next image, women erecting the teepee. As I mentioned earlier, most women would put up the teepees. They would get, of course, enlist their young sons or nephews to help putting things up. But it was the women who basically put up our teepees. And I remember being told once that no woman in her right mind would allow a man to put up their family dwelling. So it was basically, if you were a male, it was like, get out of the way and let the expert do this. And they would put up the teepee because basically they're looking after their family. our mothers and grandmothers put up the home for us that we lived in. And basically the teepee belonged to the woman, belonged to the mother. And from what I understand, and I may be wrong, but I don't think I am, is that you're lucky to have a wife that would let you put your images on her teepee. If we look at the next image, these are some of the things inside the teepee. Now this is a teepee liner. Now the teepee liners were had a dual purpose. One was because of the fire in the teepee, is that if there was no teepee liner, your very actions, anything that you do would be seen on the reflection on the outside of your teepee. So in order to kind of keep things private, this teepee liner diffused that light so that you could see the light coming from the teepee, but you couldn't see what the people inside the teepee were doing, which was good for a lot of different reasons. But that's what the teepee liner's one purpose was. And the other purpose is it directed the wind coming in underneath the teepee cover to go up that teepee liner, and the wind would basically go up through the smoke flap. So if you had a fire burning inside your teepee, this wind going out behind this teepee liner would catch that smoke and take it outside of the teepee so that people wouldn't choke or would have a teepee filled with smoke. So this was ingenious, really, when you think about that. That was an ingenious idea. And on warm days, you could open up that teepee liner and pull up the teepee cover and allow wind to come through while still enjoying shade. Or you can close it completely, like in the winter times, to keep yourself really, really warm, because it sort of added an extra layer of insulation. And behind the teepee liner, you could store your firewood or fuel, keep it dry. Even if it was raining or snowing outside, most of your fuel would be dry because it's inside the teepee. So the teepee liners didn't just serve the purpose of covering light. They actually had a few purposes. Plus, you could decorate them. They were pretty, as you'll see in some of these other pictures that we'll be coming up upon. So if we move to the next image, we could take a look at the teepee interior, the basic setup. Here we have two images of teepee interiors, but they're both the same in the sense that in the middle, well, let's look at the door. Well, the door was always on the east, face the east. And then across from the door, well, actually, you have your fire. You can see you have your fire, where is it? There. Your fire, your hearth. And then on the other side of the fire, on the other side of the door, that's where the teepee owner, that would be his space. And perhaps there could be an altar between him and the fire. And on each side, he would have his family on this side and guests or other family on the other side. So if we go to the next image, we can see another setup, ground floor setup. And this could probably make some more sense. But there you see the door opening again. You see the fireplace. You see the little altar there, and then the owner's space right behind there, the west side of the teepee. And then you would have spaces for the rest of your family on each side of him. So this was a teepee interior basic setup. Now if we go take a look at this image, you can see the willow backrests. Well, these willow backrests served a couple of purposes. First, it was sort of like a couch. Well, it was a couch. It's like your lazy boy recliner. Basically, you could set it up however you wanted to, while you're sitting in it, to support your back, and the tripod would support your weight. And so you could either recline in a sitting position while doing work, or you could stretch it out so that you could get a little bit of shut-eye. But the whole beauty of the willow backrest was also that you could just roll it up just like that and hook it up on your travois or on your horse and move it from one place to the other. So it was actually really, really efficient and didn't take up much space when you needed to travel. So these willow backrests also had that extra duty or use as sort of like a room divider. Between sleeping areas, you could put that up and sort of divide your area within the teepee. So if we look at this next image, this is a teepee interior. So if you look at that image, you can kind of see what I mentioned. You're kind of looking in through the door, and you're seeing across is the owner's space, and then you could see the hearth, the fire, and a little altar there. Then you could see the teepee backrests sort of separating the owner's area from the other area where people have buffalo hides, where they're sleeping or doing their work. Basically a basic teepee interior. And you can see from these photos, some of the different teepee interiors that there were. We go look at the next image. You can see the grandfather there with the little boy, and you can see how the teepee liner in the back has motifs, family design on those particular teepee liners. So it kind of adds color to the teepee, that particular type of teepee. So if we go to the next image, we'll just see another teepee interior. In this picture here, you can almost see 7 men all on just 1/4 of the teepee. So if that teepee was filled, you could probably have as much as 20 people inside that teepee. And you can see the teepee liner as well, that it's hanging up pretty high. So the teepee liners actually weren't low. They could be as high as 5-6 feet high up in the teepee. In fact, I think the higher is more the norm, 6 feet or so. But like I mentioned, those teepee liners serve the purpose of catching the draft and keeping the teepee warm. Let's go to the next image. This could have been the same image as the other one, just the other side of the teepee. But let's go move on to the next image. This is one of our revealed elders, and this is a picture of her in the teepee years and years ago. But you can see the storyboard image on the left side of her too on that teepee, that there's a story being told there with those images. And so the teepee liner could serve as a storyboard, I suppose, as well. But let's go to the next image. Actually, let's go to the next image. These are just more pictures of teepee interiors, as you can see here. Let's go to the next image here. So you're just seeing some of the inside of some different teepees where people would put their clothing, where they would put their beadwork, where they would put their sacred stuff. Well, actually, most of the sacred stuff in a teepee would be the next image. Let's take a look at the next image. Next one after that. Yeah, the headdresses and everything would be put above, tied to that part of the lodge between the poles. And so what we're looking at is the inside of one of the traditional teepees from around 1880, 1890. So okay, now we're going into these. This is the Blackfoot camp, and these are painted lodges. And I just kind of wanted to just speak a little about the painted lodges. I wanted to mention that the bottom skirt on most of these teepees all kind of represent the earth. Well, not kind of, they represent the earth. But every teepee owner knows the story of his teepee. And here at BCHP, we're not going to speak to some of the stories here because that's not really our place. So for those of you out there who would really like to know what certain symbols mean or something, we do have definitions for some of these things. Like we can speak freely to the smoke flaps, because on most of the Blackfoot teepees, these represent star systems, but to us, they're just stories of children. So we have the Big Dipper up there on the North Flap. What people know today as a Big Dipper, but to us are the 7 children. And then on the other side is the Pleiades system. And that basically is another story of the neglected children. So these images sort of reminded our people to take care of our children. But if you look at teepees, the bottom portion, the bottom skirt as they call it, that represented things here on earth. And then in the middle, sort of like those things that are happening here on earth. And then on the top part, it's those things to do with the heavens. So it's sort of like Mother Sky, Father Sky, Mother Earth. But there's a lot involved, and I would suggest if anybody really wanted to know the story of any particular teepee, go to that teepee owner and ask them, and then you could learn the story. But otherwise, we could kind of rare. In those days, for instance, if you had 200